Welcome to Music and Medicine. Welcome to Music and Medicine.
Welcome to Music and Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Moshe Lewis.
Welcome to Music and Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Moshe Lewis. We are bringing you a special edition with Earl Johnson Jr. We are so excited to have him. He is the CEO of an organization, takeitdownnow.org. And the work they're doing is so phenomenal, not only in its historic context, but in really righting a lot of wrongs. We often cover various topics on our show, and one of the ones that's so important is how we as a people often feel slighted, taken advantage of, and essentially forgotten, even in America today. Confederate monuments are something that continue to serve as a reminder of a very dangerous and horrible part of our history. And his organization is dedicated to making sure that those monuments are removed. But more importantly than that, there is a historical context of actually overt racism and white supremacy that they represent that simply can't continue to go on. Mr. Johnson, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. It's a pleasure to be here and really an honor to speak with you about this very important issue that is often overlooked and or given really secondary treatment, and something that really should be top of mind for folks. And we understand it's about educating people as to what these Confederate monuments represent.
I know that a lot of the passion that you have developed about this project, takeitdownnow.org, stems from the memory of your father, and that's how our conversation began. Can you tell us about him and the work that he did that was so important?
Yes, Dad, Earl Johnson, Earl M. Johnson, grew up poor in Huntington, West Virginia, often referred to as the poorest town in the poorest state in America. Grew up with two very caring parents, the oldest of five. His parents, although my grandparents did not go to college, they made sure that all of their kids did. Dad was a double GI Bill college and law school graduate. He served in the Korean War. He achieved the rank of lieutenant and came back to law school at Howard University in Washington. And at the time, Thurgood Marshall was dean. He had just, Marshall had just successfully prosecuted Brown v. Board of Education. And so he was tutoring after classes, promising students about going back home once they graduated and prosecuting Brown v. Board in their home state. Like many issues that are important to Black Americans, the issue of desegregation of the school systems was one of state rule, states' rights. And so Dad did just that. He and Mom returned here to Jacksonville, Florida, where Mom's parents lived, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a board member of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company. And so Dad began focusing, came to Jacksonville, which was a very racist, a very segregated, a town steeped in white supremacy law, whether you want to call that Jim Crow or segregation or apartheid. White supremacy law is what it is. Laws that prevented Blacks from eating at certain counters, going to beaches, pools, bathrooms, restaurants, et cetera, of course, having to be relegated to certain schools. And so Dad began prosecuting cases around the state of Florida. He actually sued 34 counties. There are, I believe, 67 counties in the state. And he virtually single-handedly sued as many counties as he could in the state, the larger counties, of course, to enforce Black children's rights to go to school where they wanted. And so he did that. He quickly gained national attention in that regard. And when Dr. King looked at some of the photos from the Monsoor Hotel pool incident, this is where I think she was 11 at the time, an 11-year-old Black girl was swimming in the Monsoor Hotel pool in St. Augustine, Florida, which was against the law because she was Black. And the white manager, he came out and began pouring muriatic acid into the pool near her. It was captured on film. It was published in Life magazine. It still is at the Smithsonian now. And
let's put a time context on this. What time would
yes, this is in 1963, and so then into 1964. The spring of 1964 was a series of local protests that were happening that were organically driven in St. Augustine. St. Augustine was one of the most racist towns in the country. And let me explain when I say that. The very sheriff's office was infiltrated with KKK members. Okay. And so that gives you an idea of the system that existed at the time. Blacks could not go to St. Augustine Beach. Blacks could not swim in the pools that were public. Blacks obviously were relegated to certain places to live and eat and work and be educated. And so Dr. King saw this photograph that was very moving. And the juxtaposition of the oldest city in the country dealing with the nation's oldest sin was just, I think, very, very poignant to him. And he set on coming to Florida. It was his only civil rights march in Florida ever. And so he called Dad.
And this would have been, now we're early 1964.
That's right. Early 1964. By the spring of that year, it was clear that Dr. King would be planning a series of protests and marches in early summer, keeping in mind that at this point, President Johnson's had been pushing the Civil Rights Act, and it was now before Congress. Mm-hmm. Dr. King believed that this focus, this last push, if you will, on what was happening to Black people in America, and to really draw attention to St. Augustine, would push over the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and in fact, it did. And so he called Dad that spring. It was clear that they were going to begin to march, and it wasn't very often, frankly, that Dr. King involved lawyers. There are only a few. I think Attorney Gray and my father, in terms of lawyers on the ground. And so Dr. King, Andy Young, Reverend Abernathy, Hosea Williams, all came to my parents' home here in Jacksonville in 1964. In late May, to organize the marches on St. Augustine and to prepare for Dr. King and his entourage's eventual arrest. They're quite concerned about Dr. King's safety in St. Augustine, given that the police, the sheriff's office, were involved with the KKK.
Sure. And give us a context, sort of, just because of the current times that we live in with debate, when you talk about President Johnson sort of trying to push the civil rights bill through, sort of what the U.S. was like at that time. We know there was some turmoil following the assassination, obviously, of the president, and yet you have this very big movement afloat at a congressional level.
America was a country steeped in white supremacy law. We often refer to it as Jim Crow law or segregation. Those are nice words, but it was white supremacy law, which said that Blacks were not good enough to congregate with white people, whether that was schools, bathrooms, and certainly couldn't marry them. And so the second-class nature of our society was not relegated to the Deep South, for sure. And these mores, some of them, as we know, still exist, or throughout. And before, so let's just step back 100 years for a moment to Plessy v. Ferguson, when the United States Supreme Court deemed that Blacks could have separate but equal facilities. Plessy was trying to get a first-class ticket on a train because he could afford it. He was Black, though. And so that was the law of the land. White supremacy through Plessy was the law of the land for decades until Brown v. Board, which in essence found that separate could not be equal, and of course related to the school systems. But beyond the school system, of course, that's how law works. It spread to other areas. So, and of course, the Civil Rights Act, which came a full 10 years later, expanded to public places. And so that is sort of the setting, the atmosphere. Now, let's include the real violence that was occurring there as well.
Right.
It was not uncommon for mobs of white men to be carrying shotguns and rifles around, many of which had been deputized by the local sheriff. As I said, sheriff's deputies were members of the KKK. There was an organization called the St. Augustine Rifle Club, which was actually the local KKK club. A few years before, just 24 miles north in Jacksonville, was the Axe Handle Saturday event, where a mob of white men, many of which dressed in Confederate clothing, Confederate uniforms, attacked and savagely beat children, students who were peacefully protesting in a sit-in at a counter. So and let me just go back another to the 1920s. 1923, Florida had a town by the name of Rosewood, and like Tulsa and like Wilmington, North Carolina, it was a Black township, and it was destroyed by a white mob who murdered and pillaged and literally took a whole town over. When I was a young lawyer, I was involved in that case in reparations. We actually, the large law firm that I worked for, we actually won that case. But so there's a long history of racial violence and white supremacy law and infiltration in law enforcement by the KKK here in Florida. And that was the setting that Dr. King was stepping into when he came here in early summer of 1964.
Sure. You would have been very young during this time of your early dad's work, even though you may be young enough to not have been around during that time. To what extent did you sense also the danger that your dad perceived that he was in? Because as you stated, he was probably one of few or the only type of lawyer working in this type of way.
You know, so I was born in 1965. My older sister, who's a physician, a psychiatrist, Robin, was a toddler during those times. And so she remembers Dr. King and the men who were there. And of course, I grew up with these stories around the dinner table. Mom referred to Dr. King as Martin and Ambassador Young as Andy. And so, you know, our sort of education happened around the dinner table. But the significance of my parents' involvement hit me by the time I was 7 or 8 years old and answering the telephone or getting the mail. And so there were times you'd answer the phone and the other person on the line would, obviously a white man, would say, you know, put that bastard on the phone, referring to my father. It was commonplace. In fact, our family has a story where my sister was answering the phone at one point, my older sister. And someone came on and said just that. My dad got on the phone and said, sir, you can talk to me any kind of way, but you just cannot speak to my daughter or say those words to my daughter. She's 11 years old. And sure enough, the guy would call back and he would say, hello, miss, is your father there? He would be very polite. And then dad get on the phone and he'd say, you bastard, and get right into his racist rant. We would get these crazy packages in the mail, sometimes suspicious, as a kid, and this would be in the 70s. So the danger and significance of what my dad was involved in was made clear to me about those times. And by the time I was a teenager and in college, in fact, in the 80s, Dr. King was certainly less than a national hero. You may recall, he was a source of controversy and still is for many people. And so passing his birthday bill was a big deal. And so all of my life, I have felt the pushback of efforts, and certainly of my parents, to move us forward. That's just part of the deal.
Sure. I know you're very you're cavalier about it now as a young man in terms of how it emboldened you, but also challenged your sense of how evil and cruel people can be. What were some of the emotions that you felt, that you dealt with as a teenager, going into college, and then ultimately deciding to go into law?
I've always been very proud of my father's work, right, with Dr. King. It's always been unique, notwithstanding the fact that I had always known about it. And so it's always been part of my life and always been part of my experience. But I was shy about it in public because Dr. King, with white people and kids that I was around who were, parenting their parents' values, that Dr. King evoked anger and emotion from people, and of how often it's very similar to what's happening now. I often heard, "Oh, he changed the good old days," right? He changed how things were, and so these were white people's perspectives, some of them directly to me, and so I was shy about my dad's work. By the time I was making my way to law school in my early 20s, I was fascinated by his work. And it drove me. It was the reason I wanted to be a lawyer. My dad's most significant case was not Dr. King or Andrew Young. In reality, it was a woman by the name of Ida Phillips. And so she was a white woman who came to my father in the late 60s, who was single mother with school-age children who'd been denied employment at Martin Marietta. And they told her that, yeah, we're hiring men who are single with school-age children, but we just can't hire women who are single with school-age children. And that employers were not very sophisticated. Back in the day, they were not very sophisticated about their motives.
Right. And
so this case, Phillips v. Martin Marietta, which celebrates its 50th year this year, the very first time that the U.S. Supreme Court considered women's rights in the workplace under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This is the on the basis of sex case. This is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, I would submit, favorite case. She talks about it in her 1993 Senate confirmation hearings. She last spoke about it, I think, in 2018 at an international women's research conference. And so his work, my dad's work, really was so far-reaching and extraordinary that it propelled my ambition for a very long time. And I did find myself practicing law, representing folks who had been accused of crimes, representing employees who had faced discrimination, helping families keep their homes, and a variety of civil rights work, right? Whether that was age, sex, race, religion. I've handled all of those cases. But I can tell you, I was able to get people released from prison who were wrongly there, saving them, decades of their lives. But it was not as satisfying in terms of whether I was moving us forward, really moving social justice forward in ways that could make a difference to many, many, many people. And I began to teach after 25 years of practicing law.
Wow.
And as an educator, I really, and this was just in the last couple of years, and then 2020 happened.
Right.
And
before we get into that,
yeah,
I want to still back up a bit, and let's talk about several people have used this phrase, conversations with my father. Talk to us about some of those conversations that you had, whether being in law school, deciding to go to law school, and just some of how that dynamic, because I think it's something that's not often brought out in our community as well. This is a family of lawyers, and certainly taking on a very monumental work at multiple levels.
Well, around the dinner, mom was a professor. And so mom literally taught for 48 years, 17 years in the public school system, the very school system that dad was suing at the time. You can imagine the pushback that she felt at her schools. Became the first Black faculty member at Jacksonville University in 1970 and taught there for 30 years. And so education and learning at all levels was paramount to our parents. My younger sister, Perry, went to Harvard Law. My older sister, Robin, the physician I was telling you about, went to Harvard undergrad. Perry's most famous classmate is President Obama. And President Obama tapped her for the director of legal affairs for the International Atomic Energy Agency 10 years ago, where she remains. So she's into her third administration. But so we have always been very focused on what's happening in the world and what's happening in our community and neighborhoods. I think we've always been focused in public service, given what our parents showed us through their example. And we've, including my younger brother, Nelson, who's a producer in Los Angeles, we've all gone about it in our own way. But that was absolutely a foundation that was built on family values, on our collective social values of my parents and their friends and colleagues around the country and locally, and in our extended family. And so that is the world in which we grew up. And yet there was a sense, even for my parents in the 70s, which waned in the 80s, frankly, that great progress had been made, right? That folks actually talked about the civil rights struggle in the past tense, right? And so, and we know today that a lot of what has been window dressing has not been progress.
Sure. No, that's a key point.
Yes.
And I want to jump, because luckily you only know a little bit about me, and I'm probably in a deposition or two every single week. So I'm going to bring you politely back to conversations with my father. Talk to us a little bit about just some of how that dialogue may have gone, whether it be during the time you decided to go into law or take up the mantle in civil rights and things like that, because I think it helps give us a sense of who he was and how that relationship that we don't often get to see with a Black patriarch who's an attorney and his son becoming an attorney, often portrayed in the media. Talk to us about some of those types of conversations or that dynamic between you and him.
I remember the day that Thurgood Marshall died, and the conversation that my father and I had. Thurgood Marshall was my father's mentor. They had met when Dad was at Howard University Law School. This would have been in the mid to late 50s. Justice Marshall tutored Dad on prosecuting Brown v. Board and civil rights law. And Dad, I believe, saw Thurgood's rise to the U.S. Supreme Court as sort of a natural progression of who the man was. And my father was very sad that day. At the loss of the genius, but also at the loss of his friend and mentor, and he had worry in his eyes, my dad, about what was to come. And we know who replaced Justice Marshall. And so it was just recognizing in my father's eyes what he saw as the loss of the end of an era. What he saw as a country not ready for Justice Marshall's successor or succession. And I just remember him repeating what Thurgood had said about who might replace him, which was that snakes come in many colors. And Dad repeated that day. And so at this point, I did not know that I was going to be an attorney. I didn't realize that math was going to stop me from being an architect. But I was deeply tuned in to what my dad was going through at that moment. And it helped me to understand the magnitude of the man and the magnitude of this march of racial justice. And it helped to put into perspective to me that this march of racial justice is a generational pursuit.
Right. And I think
it's a generational pursuit. And so that really did put that in, that conversation with my father that day, put that into perspective.
Yeah. And I think you're being polite there when you say generational pursuit. So I'm going to dissect that, to use a medical word. One of the most complex and profound questions that people are asked when they think about racism is, where does it come from? And typically the answer is, it's learned in the home. To what extent do you sense that white supremacy at its core is so much about really sort of being the only race, at least in this particular country, if not some others, that it supersedes the very being of people that have it? And I should explain that, meaning that they themselves may not even fully appreciate how it stems from their very sense of being and then becomes a way of thinking.
It's the normalization, Dr. Lewis, of the ideal of white supremacy. And so that works on both sets of psyches, right? Whether you're white or black. I think Dr. King said that we're all in prison until we're set free. I'm paraphrasing, by justice, regardless of race. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, just about a week before the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, gave a cornerstone speech, as it's been called. I would suggest it's the most important speech given on American soil that no one's ever heard of. But in that speech, he makes very clear what white supremacy is. And very clear that, of course, the Confederacy is founded upon it. He says, and I'm quoting, its foundations are laid, talking about the new government. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical philosophical, and moral truth. The Confederacy was relatively short-lived, about 5 years. But the ideal of white supremacy was around before the Confederacy, and it's been around much longer after the Confederacy to this day. And so we need to understand our own perceptions about ourselves as Black people. Doctor, I read a study recently in an article about it that 23 to 29% of incoming medical students who are white in America believe that somehow Black people can coagulate their blood faster, that somehow Black people heal faster than white people. There is this notion that somehow we as Black people, our bodies are somehow supernatural, our minds are feeble, as would be our motivation. The notion that we are dangerous. The media perceptions of that we are inundated with. You know, people don't understand, when I talk to folks who don't understand or don't believe in systemic racism or structural racism, I break it down for them. Understand this. Most Black people are more likely to be 2 times less employed than their white counterparts with the same education. In fact, Black people in America are more likely to be unemployed than white people with less education than they. And so if you don't understand structural racism, you can understand one hiring decision at a time, replicated by millions of times. And that's what structural racism is. It's a matter of decision makers making decisions based upon race. And,
right.
and so when we see these Confederate monuments, by the way, we're the only country in the world that has monuments or tributes to enemy combatants on public land. Remember that the Confederacy, in addition to starting its organization to maintain the enslavement of Black people, they were also treasonous. They denounced American citizenship, took up arms against America. We see these monuments at the courthouse steps, these Confederates who've been named for schools around our country. Doesn't matter where you are, from California to Delaware, streets, roads, appellations, anything that can be named has been named for a Confederate in this country.
And I think you told us the numbers upwards of 1,800.
Yeah, there are 1,800 of these tributes. And you ask yourself, what is this about? Are these, wow, I didn't realize there were all these fans of the loser, where's the Benedict Arnold statue? I'm still looking for that traitor's monument. But this isn't about the Confederacy. It's about white supremacy. It's about what the Confederacy represents. These are tributes to white supremacy that help normalize it, along with everything else. So I suggest to you that the dehumanization of Black people from our very entree, of course, to this country, 12 million coming over at the bottom of these vessels. I mean, just in a horrific, savage way, we were chattel and dealt with as you deal with your property, abused and discarded when you want it. And so the dehumanization of our bodies, the dehumanization of our minds over generations, coupled with legislation to preclude economic growth in Black America, such as redlining, literally could not get a mortgage on property if it was a Black neighborhood for 60 years in this country, during the very time that the middle class grew. And we all know it grows primarily by land ownership. Home ownership is the number one investment for most Americans. During this time, the extraordinary increase in the incarceration of Black men, to this day, I mean, the records are very clear, the reports are very clear, the surveys are very clear that if you are Black, you're going to get a 5 times more harsh sentence in federal court than if you're white. We know that Black children are punished more harshly than their white counterparts. We know that a Black baby is 3 times more likely to die in the care of a white doctor. These are facts. I would suggest these are facts that are driven by racism and the notion of white supremacy. And so, to answer your question, Doctor, it impacts us in every facet of our lives, to your very point that we don't become aware, we're unaware of it. And so we grow up. I mean, imagine a Germany where you grew up and there were statues of Hitler everywhere, and then swastika. I would suggest that Germany handled it correctly. And by the way, Hitler was a huge fan of the Confederacy. If the Confederacy said they were the first government founded upon white supremacy, the Third Reich was the second government in the world founded upon white supremacy. Hitler studied the Confederacy and white supremacy through their eyes. And so imagine a Germany that had these statues to Hitler. Well, that's what we have here. We literally have statues to enemy combatants of our own country who committed treason based upon the ideal of white supremacy and the enslavement and ownership of Black Americans. And they're everywhere. And so we grew up, they're like, I compare them to mountains, if you will. No one questions the legitimacy of a mountain, right? I mean, you're born, there's a mountain, you die, it'll still be there. That's been true for a lot of these Confederate monuments on public land in America. And by the way, we spend about $40 million a year, every several years, according to the Smithsonian, in public money, tax funds, to pay for the preservation of these monuments. And so no one questions the legitimacy of mountain. And these monuments are sort of like that. They are just around. And people say, what's the big deal? It's a statue. Or why are you trying to erase history? Well, first and foremost, let's look at when these things were placed and by whom they were placed. Of the 1,800 tributes, 400 of them were placed by the Daughters of the Confederacy, that I like to refer to as the family auxiliary of the KKK. They were founded just a year after. And when you read the dedication ceremony speeches throughout the decades, they actually say, the people that place these monuments to the Confederacy actually say, this is a tribute to white supremacy. They say those words. So, it's part of the normalization of white supremacy. It's part of the normalization of the ideal that Black people are lesser than. That is why that officer thought he could murder George Floyd in broad daylight on camera, on numerous cameras, because he knew, based upon everything he had been taught in his life, everything he had been told by media and government and teachers and parents and friends and family, was that Black people just don't matter that much. Their lives don't matter that much.
And let's drill into that with a different statistic that you may somewhat be familiar with, maybe give us some accuracy around. How often or likely is it that a white police officer would go to jail for essentially any crime against any perpetrator, but certainly any Black perpetrator?
Well, it's my understanding that just this year we had our first conviction, right, of an officer for murder of any kind, for a murder count of a Black person. Which, I mean, that's extraordinary when you consider all of the hundreds and likely thousands of deaths, unarmed deaths, and unjustified deaths at the hands of white policemen, of Black people. And so I think it's just extraordinary, the disconnect. And if there has to be one prime example of this dehumanization, it must be the police relationship with the Black community. It has to be that. And we didn't get to this point overnight. And it's very easy to look to the Black Code enforcers after the Emancipation Proclamation was announced and enforced. Very quickly in the South, there began these quote unquote Black codes. And as the name suggests, these were new laws for Black people. And they often had to do with getting rounded up and brought back to the plantation. And indentured servitude was a real thing after slavery in America. And it certainly wasn't limited only to Black people. But these Black codes, these Black code enforcers became what is our modern day police institution in America, our law enforcement. And so the utter notion, first of all, that that you can be stopped on the color of your skin because the color of your skin is going to predetermine your actions is extraordinary, or that the color of your skin alone provides a probable cause for a stop because your future actions are going to likely be criminal. That's a discussion that we've been having the last 20 years. So to me, it's really extraordinary that we haven't been more alarmed by the blatant racism that is part and parcel of police practice in America. Now,
and when you
as a 25-year lawyer,
I just want to jump in there because when you say we, I think it's more so they.
They, yeah.
because this whole notion that first came up in some of the music, well, maybe not first came up in the music, but was definitely characterized, we'll say, visually in music, and then documented in various films, and then talked about through various commentary, and then the mantra of a lot of civil rights leaders was essentially, for all intents and purposes, ignored, or at least seen as not being accurate until George Floyd's murder, for all intents and purposes. Because if I'm not mistaken, there really were no prosecutions we talked about for murder, but I don't know of any major prosecutions against white officers for any of those other types of lesser crimes than murder.
Me either. Me either. They're all, and so from a legal aspect, just quickly, there is a thing called qualified immunity, and it's a law which gives police a get out of jail free card. And the way it works is this. The notion is that if the officer is acting the way any other officer would normally act, then he or she cannot be prosecuted at all in any form, and is therefore justified in their actions. Well, we know that cops are utilizing racist practices day in and day out. So if the notion is we're going to set you, if the bar is going to be, are you going to react in a racist way? And if yes, that's okay. Where's the justice there? And so that is qualified immunity. There's a big push, of course, in Congress now. It's a federal law. It's a big push in Congress now to get rid of qualified immunity, or to lessen its extraordinary impact. Also, too, of course, prosecutions are based upon the decision-making of the prosecutors. There's a thing called prosecutorial decision-making and prosecutorial judgment, which allows a certain independence of local district attorneys and state attorneys to bring a case against a cop. The relationship, I can tell you, between the prosecution, state attorneys' offices, district attorneys' offices, and judges is extraordinary. When you go to a fraternal order of police event, such as a holiday event, you will see more judges and more prosecutors than you will at a bar or judicial meeting. This extraordinary special relationship between cops and judges is evident and undeniable. What you don't have, of course, is a relationship between judges in the Black community or police in the Black community. The city of Jacksonville, my hometown, just elected its first Black attorney to become a judge ever last year, Judge Rhonda Peoples. So we have a long way to go when it comes to what's happening in the judicial system. But just it to me, so to me though, it is a wonderful microcosm, if you will. It's a wonderful look inside of really what systemic racism looks like. I haven't even talked about the privatization of prisons.
Sure. Yes, and I know you're trying to be poetic. One thing that I want to cover, I know our time is growing thin, but what obligation do you feel, because they are our future, that the young people have with respect to not only carrying this mantra forward, this mantle forward of civil rights, of being seen as equal, fall on the younger generation? And I'll specifically quote some of the things that they're famous for saying. I am not a role model. I use the word, which I don't even need to say, in a 15 different types of manners. At first, he used to say that it was a term of brotherhood, and the list continues on, because I think that well, I know that one of the key reasons we want to be able to talk to is not only the Black excellence that's portrayed in your family, with all the work that you've done now, almost over 70 years, but also this importance of Black excellence, and also needing to continue to get deeper into these various organizations and essentially correct the laws and right the wrongs.
That's a big question. And there's so much there. Being an educator, I have this wonderful opportunity on a daily basis to connect with young people. And notwithstanding what we have seen adults do recently, it gives me a lot of hope when I talk to kids. They seem to get a lot of things that we adults don't understand from a social standpoint. We've lost, as a nation, the opportunity, the ability to talk to one another, to talk to people with whom you disagree. That is a virtual impossibility now in our country, obviously driven in large part by social media and the siloing of our information. But I don't see the same with young people. And so I encourage them to have and to be ready, prepared with information to have those tough discussions. And believe me, they're having them at the age of 11, 12 years old, middle school. And whether that's race or sex, orientation. And so there is an urgency to me that has built up, frankly, as it relates to making real progress in racial justice in this country. There's a fire that's been lit under me, and I think many people, that has not waned from last summer at all, and has only begun to flourish and grow and to receive oxygen. And I want to pass on that sense of urgency to the next generation. We don't have time to rest on our laurels. We learned this in the 70s and 80s when we thought we'd made progress. When we talked about racial justice or civil rights in the past, the struggle in the past tense, We know that not to be true now. And so to pass on the baton with a sense of urgency and a sense of direction, but understanding the requirement now of a civil discussion, the civility. We got to go. Look, there's only one way to change a law, right? And that's either to vote for it or to change the minds of the folks who are going to vote for it, or to vote in new people. We got to do it two ways. Every preacher in America talks this talk, right? We got to be in the streets, but we also got to be in the seats. And so they are right when they say it. So we got to continue to put out great physicians and great engineers and educators and lawyers, and keep the eye on the prize. And the prize is simply this: justice and equality under the law. That is the promise, the great promise of this country. Equal justice under the law. We would be a long way ahead if we could attain that.
Absolutely. Do you feel that some of that can come in the social media representations and some of the things that we do? I'm talking about in the videos, in the movies, and in the language that's used, just we ourselves, even in our community, because sort of that concept of I'm going to gain respect by giving respect.
Wow. That's so well put. I love that notion. Because that's the way we're going to have to do it. I don't have problems working with Confederate organizations in helping to relocate monuments, get these monuments to benefactors who are willing to pay for their relocation, for example. We've got to be able to reach common ground as we move forward with the goal of social and racial justice. And so we've got to have the tough conversations. We've got to actively campaign for those who represent our values. We've got to engage in our communities. We've got to get into schools to reach our children, to be mentors to our children. So 80% of teachers in America are white. Over 60% of those teachers believe that race, and in particular, the history of Black people in America, and in particular, our contributions, because it's limited to Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and MLK. That education about Black people in America is poorly taught, and these are white teachers. And so that's really where the work begins. We have a pathetic level of education as it relates to us in our school system. I would suggest that it's purposeful. Again, part of this states' rights issue. Many states don't mention slavery as a reason for the Confederacy or a reason for the Civil War. The work, I think, begins with educating us about who we are and who we have been in our true history. The fact that people are just learning about Tulsa or Wilmington. When you consider, I just have to step back for a moment, just to get, I just want to just get back to this notion that you raised earlier, Doctor, in terms of what has been the toll on our psyche. I'm sure you've seen these postcards from the 20s, 30s, 40s of white gangs of men posing around a mangled black corpse that they've lynched, faces fully, brazenly shown. We are fighting against decades, centuries, to be more accurate, of the dehumanization of Black people in America. And so the work is cut out. And that is why I would suggest to you that it is a generational pursuit, not just, and you've been very kind, not just for my family, but for everyone's family.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. Tell us about your organization's website, the work you're doing, and some upcoming projects where we can find more about you and what you're doing.
Thank you. So if my dad was involved in taking down signs of racism, whites only, coloreds only signs, which in fact, that's what he was engaged in those public accommodations cases, what we do at takeitdownnow.org is to effort to take down those symbols of racism, symbols of white supremacy in the way of tributes to the Confederacy. We find them on public land all over the country, names of schools, etc. Over 1,800. We spend millions and millions and millions in tax dollars annually on these monuments. I started this organization with one goal in mind, and that is to, at one day, sunset the organization. That is, when the last Confederate tribute on public land comes down, so we'll takeitdownnow.org. We've become a clearinghouse connecting individuals and entities from around the country that are engaged locally in this effort. So, like school curriculum, like school desegregation, the issue of Confederate monuments is local, is a home rule issue. And so the decision makers are local. So for example, in Galveston, Texas, a tribunal of judges decides what happens to the Confederate monument at the courthouse there. In St. Augustine, when we were successful last year to get the footman soldier Confederate monument removed from the Plaza de Constitución in St. Augustine, that was based upon a vote of the St. Augustine City Commission. So depending upon where you are in the country, decision makers are different, but helping to empower those that are in the fight locally is what we're all about. The first plank of our platform is education, and really getting the word out as to what the Confederacy is about and why these monuments to the Confederacy are not just monuments to the Confederacy, but they're monuments to white supremacy. And that's why the KKK and the neo-Nazis rally around these monuments today. They understand what they represent. And so we have been helpful around the country. We continue to grow in what we're doing. We are excited to have just connected with a production company in Los Angeles who wants to do a documentary about what's going on around the country with regard to Confederate monuments. I am very, very hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. We need really help from folks who are very interested in this issue. It doesn't matter where you live, but if you're interested in helping to relocate Confederate monuments from public land and end the scourge of tributes to white supremacy on our landscape, join us. We're at takeitdownnow.org. Drop me a line.
Sure. I so appreciate you giving us time, and really the work that you're doing I consider to be so monumental, and the history lesson we received today instrumental in realizing how important exactly what the key issues are, because so often, like you said, we can walk on by and not really even realize what we've passed by in the same way that somebody may drive by a mountain and not appreciate its inner beauty. Likewise, we may pass by these statues and not appreciate their inner sins. So it's so great that you were kind and willing to give us time and join us here on musicmedicine.org, where we really take some time to dig into some of the deeper issues, because racism to us is a medical blight and has become a disease state throughout the whole country. And I think you put it well, stating that it exemplifies the dehumanization of us as a people, and certainly does not help us to flourish in the way that we need to. We don't want our kids to go through their lives not appreciating not only their history, but their self-worth. And taking down these statues is definitely a key step in helping to augment the humanity of everyone, but certainly of people of color, especially Black people.
That's right.
Been dehumanized essentially since being brought here. Thank you again so much for your time, Mr. Johnson.
Dr. Lewis, it's been indeed my honor to be here. Your format is an extraordinary opportunity to really dig deep into issues and to talk thoughtfully about them. And so I really appreciate this time today. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Welcome to Music and Medicine. Welcome to Music and Medicine. Welcome to Music and Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Moshe Lewis.